Good morning and welcome to the Pennsylvania State Grange's virtual leadership workshop for this morning, May 8th. This morning, we are pleased to welcome Doug Bonsall, Chair of the Pennsylvania State Grange History Committee, to lead our discussion this morning about preserving the past for the future of your Grange. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Doug.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity, and since our group is small, I would encourage you to feel free to give your opinions, ask your questions as we move along. I'm going to share the screen, and you should now have full-size slides in front of you for this presentation, which is short and probably not new information for most of you on the call, but some pointers that I'd like to suggest and perhaps discuss. I've called this Preserving the Past for the Future of Your Grange, and this is particularly appropriate as we in Pennsylvania are about to launch the celebration of 150 years of the Pennsylvania State Grange. And I'm going to stand up a little bit and show you my t-shirt. This is the t-shirt. Many of you already have one of them to celebrate that event. We're going to be kicking off the celebration of the State Grange's sesquicentennial in September in conjunction with the 150th anniversary of our very first Grange, Eagle Number 1, which is already celebrating because it was organized in 1871, 2 years before the State Grange was founded. This quote is from Winston Churchill and says that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Something that I thought was appropriate because as I've been reading history, both of Eagle Grange and of the State Grange for months and months, there are some things that perhaps we can do better in for our future if we don't repeat some of the shortcomings that we see from the past in terms of keeping records of our Granges. So when we talk about records, there are many different types of records. The first at the top of the list is pretty obvious. These are the minutes of Grange meetings. Some of the minutes are very descriptive and really gives a good overview of what happened in a Grange. Others are very sketchy. We'll talk about some of those things a little bit later. Scrapbooks, which are often kept by committees, youth, juniors, women's activities or family activities, community service, are wonderful places to get a sense of the Grange's history, and actually many times will give more information than will the meeting minutes, because the scrapbooks often have a narrative, usually include pictures. They also often include news clippings. Many Granges have good relationships with local newspapers, and so there are regular news reports in those publications, and it's important that information be kept, if not in a scrapbook or in the minute book, perhaps in some separate kind of a document where these things are put together and perhaps saved in plastic sleeves or whatever. One thing that is very obvious as I've been going through the historical material is that there are so many clippings that have been cut out of newspapers and there are absolutely no dates on it. It will say that such and such a Grange will meet Saturday, May the 7th or whatever, but there's no year. Sometimes there's not even a date. The Grange will meet next Wednesday. So when those kinds of things are clipped out, it's really important to make sure that there's a date so there's some point of reference. Pictures the same way. Pictures are wonderful. But if they are loose pictures, not perhaps identified in a scrapbook, it's very important that there be some sort of identification on these pictures as to who's in the picture and what the picture is all about. Because Jen and I have gone through hundreds and hundreds of pictures at the State Grange office and are trying to get them in some semblance of order. But unfortunately, there are many, many of those that we have no idea who they are, where they're from, what the event was. So that's a real missing piece of our history. Oral interviews are possible. It's something that our State Grange History Committee is just beginning to experiment with. We purchased the camera equipment, and as soon as COVID is over, we hope to resume doing some more oral interviews, because once the people who were the history makers are gone, you can never get back that exact perspective. So it's really interesting and worthwhile to collect their thoughts. Some of the questions as to why bother? Well, obviously preserving your history and all of those various types of documents or media is so that this information is available to tell the story of the Grange. None of us are going to be here forever, but we can leave a legacy by preserving this information and making sure that it tells the complete story of the Grange. And referring to those materials will help to, in many cases, to guide decisions for the future. You'll know what was successful and perhaps what needed to be revamped in some way. So I think that all of us have the responsibility to pass down the things like success, failure, or how things are done, the processes. Perhaps one of the things that I've seen over many years is that we want new people to come in and be active and assume leadership in the Grange, but we may not adequately communicate what processes are to get things done. And so people become overwhelmed and frustrated, not knowing exactly how to do things. And then very obviously, these historical resources are important when we have need to look at that information. For instance, during an anniversary, we're trying to update and record information, and you need good resources in order to do so. So how do you go about this? Here's just a few thoughts that I'd like to share with you, suggesting that the minutes of meetings be concise and yet complete enough to explain what happened. Complete meaning that although you may not record every single bit of discussion, hopefully what is recorded will give a sense of what took place and perhaps why it took place. For instance, and there's a lot of difference of opinion in government and business as to what should be recorded in minutes. I'm going to suggest, and this isn't official in any way, but just from the point of a historian, that it's good to have a little bit of explanation. I could give you an example. Recently at Eagle Grange, we entered into a project, and if we were only recording the real basic facts, we could say the Grange moved second and passed to plant trees on the property and install bluebird boxes. And that is exactly what happened. But what I think from a historical perspective is interesting, and Jen as our secretary did record this, that this was brought up by a member because of concern for the environment. And as the project was discussed and eventually adopted, it involved the local FFA, who was present at the meeting. They had an interest in this. They volunteered to not only plant the trees, but to build the bird boxes. So putting just a few words of explanation would show how this all came about and the significance of reaching out to other groups in the community. Also, it may seem elementary to even mention that the minutes should be signed and dated, but in looking through boxes and boxes of records at the State Grange, it's amazing how many minutes are not signed. Some are just signed with a first name like Mary. I'm not sure who Mary is or was, but I think that kind of information is a basic responsibility of secretaries. Then the whole idea of reports, pictures, and clippings uh, are great, whether they're done for a particular committee within your Grange or if it's a general scrapbook, but consolidate all of this information in some sort of logical order. Much more useful in the long run than throwing things in a drawer or in a shoebox and then 10 or 15 or 25 years later, here's the next generation saying, who are these people? What's this all about? Another thing, especially for the more significant things that are pictures and clippings, are to consider framing and displaying them. Jen has recently taken a project up at Eagle to do that, and it's amazing how interesting it is to see a whole frame, like a collage of pictures about a particular part of that Grange's life or some specific project. Permanent storage is the ultimate goal. Most of our records in the Grange are on paper, and that's the original format that we begin with. That may not necessarily be the best for long-term preservation. So there are things like microfilming those paper records. We're told by the Pennsylvania State Archives, which stores some of Grange records, although at the moment they are not accepting additional records. Microfilm is the best media for permanent preservation. Now it has its drawbacks because you need to have the equipment to be able to view microfilm, but the film is, we are told by preservationists, the best for long-term and permanent preservation. However, for accessibility purposes, converting those microfilm images to a digital form that you can post on the internet is really great, and that's something we've done with the records of the Pennsylvania State Grange. Because for many years, I knew that there were very complete records in the State Grange office, but unless you had access to that office and time to research while the office was open, it was not generally available to our membership. And we're pleased to say that we have all of the records like journals of proceedings, officers' registers, executive committee minutes, all done electronically and posted to the State Grange website. Have any of you used that resource that we had? We surprisingly have gotten a fair number of inquiries from people who are doing genealogical research or sometimes community historical research. And they're not always aware that this is out there, but they have expressed their pleasure to me when they have used it and indicated that it is very accessible by having that electronic digital copy file there on the internet. The only slight drawback about that is as a computer change over the years, the current format, the digital format, may not necessarily be the format that we'll be using on computers in the future. But if you have the microfilm or if you have the original, then we can probably adapt and change those postings to whatever the future digital kind of media will be. I don't have a crystal ball, don't know what that will necessarily be, but almost certainly it will change in the future. Who's responsible for preserving the records of a Grange? I think the president or master is ultimately responsible. but in most practical terms, it is the secretary who keeps the records of regular meetings, and usually committee chairs are responsible for accumulating scrapbooks, because at least here in Pennsylvania, many of those scrapbooks are judged at the annual state session for each of the respective departments of the Grange. I'd like to suggest that it might be a consideration for Granges to appoint a historian if they do not have a historian, someone or some ones who are responsible to make sure these kinds of things are maintained and that they are kept safely after the records are done. We have instances where records disappear as officers, particularly as secretaries, change. I think that the historian and or the president needs to make sure that those records, which are the property of the Grange, are adequately secured. They are not the property of any individual. And so when an individual is no longer that officer, those records should come back to the Grange and be stored in wherever or however a local Grange can accomplish that. When should records be retained and stored? Well, it needs to be done immediately, because we're making history every day as our Granges meet and do activities. And although it's very elementary to say, we need to make sure that all of these things are documented and preserved as the events happen, and as the various materials, whether they be minutes or news clippings or pictures, are generated. Because if the records are incomplete or they are lost somewhere along the way, then that information can never be replaced. And we, for instance, have that situation even with some of the state Grange records. We have a register of officers from 1878, which was shortly after the state Grange was founded, but then we have no existing copies in the state Grange office of any officer registers until the 1890s. So we don't know what happened for almost 20 years. And I have had occasion to go back when somebody wanted to know, for instance, if a Grange was active or inactive during a certain period of time. If you have the officers' registers, we have some insight into that. But when we are missing records, as many local Granges are, then there are holes in our history. And if we haven't recorded it through some other means, for instance, through oral interviews recorded, then that information is also lost as people pass away or leave the Grange membership. Where should records be stored? For paper records, there should be a secure storage site. There are many Granges who have unfortunately lost records through inadequate storage because of fires or floods, mold or mildew. So how do you avoid that? Well, the very best would be if your paper records were stored in some sort of climate controlled, humidity controlled type of environment. That's probably not feasible for many Granges. We're hoping that as the new State Archives Center is being built and open in the next couple of years, that perhaps the State Archives will once again begin accepting paper records from our Granges, because if stored at the State Archives, they are in that secure environment and we don't have to worry about flood or fire or mold and mildew damage. Short of that, I'd suggest that records be stored in a filing cabinet, preferably a fireproof filing cabinet, because there again, it would preserve in the case of a fire taking place wherever they are stored. Acid-free archival storage boxes are best. For those of you that are archivists know that there are acids in certain papers that will help to deteriorate paper records, and one way to minimize this is to use proper storage. If your records are converted electronically, then they can obviously be stored on a desktop or laptop computer hard drive. It's a great idea to make a copy onto a flash drive. Some people call that a thumb drive. And if you have the opportunity and resources to do so, to post those records to a website like we have for the State Grange records. Jen Noss is much more adept at this than I, but those large files like we've loaded to the State Grange website are actually stored in the cloud. Is that called the Google Cloud, Jen?
Yes, we have them on Google Drive so that the attachments can be viewed through a link to the cloud storage. Otherwise, the files are too large to post directly to the website in a lot of cases.
And by being stored in this cyber cloud out there that's managed by Google, they're available even if something should happen to your computer or your website, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So that's great. Microfilm is obviously what I said earlier, the very best way for long-term storage. And you can take boxes and boxes of books, have them microfilmed, and you end up with a roll or two of film. So it's very compact. The very best way to store that for long-term security is, again, where it is climate controlled, and it's possible that Granges could buy a bank deposit box, maybe not the very smallest, but a bank deposit box to safeguard films that they might have. And we have done that with the State Grange records. Everything that we have microfilmed, we also have a backup copy. So again, I began by saying that the Pennsylvania State Grange is celebrating 150 years, starting with the kickoff this September 18th, which will just coincidentally be 148 years to the day that the State Grange was organized in Reading in 1873. So if you want information about the celebration, which we're starting, and things will be going on over the next couple of years, both at the state level and hopefully in local Granges, you can go to that website that you see on this slide. That link will take you to the history page where we have information posted. There is a listing of the records that I mentioned earlier. All the existing records from 1873, the organization date of the State Grange, through the present time, are listed in those categories. The charter ledgers may not be a term that everyone is familiar with, but it is a listing of all Granges, and we have it sorted in 6 different ways. You can look at the entire list. You can look at all currently active Granges or all currently inactive Granges. You can look at them by the number of a Grange, which means something to we who are Grangers. To people on the outside, that number may not have as much significance as the additional way that we have our records, our ledgers set up, where you can sort by county. And I had a request some time ago where people wanted, who were not Grange people currently, wanted to know the Granges that had at any time served a particular community in a particular county. And so by going through that, we were able to help them. we have all of the original applications, thanks to the National Grange and Betsy sharing them with us. And we had those all both microfilmed and converted to digital copies. We have our 4 or 5 published histories, major anniversaries, all the journals of proceedings, newsletters starting, which are things like the Pennsylvania Grange News, or whatever it was called for a number of years. It was called the Pennsylvania Grange Advocate. All of those are posted chronologically, executive committee minutes, and those officers' registers that I mentioned earlier. So that's the extent of the information that I put together to just summarize this. I would be very glad to take any questions or hear your comments. What you think is most needed, most significant in terms of preserving our history. Hi, Jim Diamond. I didn't see you here before.
And how are you today?
Oh, I'm fine. I hope you are doing well.
If I was any better, I couldn't stand it.
I think I've heard that from you before.
Doug, I have a question for you.
And that is?
Who is this information that you are accumulating going to be available to, other than Grange members?
That's a good question. All of the information that we have been preserving, starting when Mary Sproat was chairman of the History Committee and continuing to the present time, has been microfilmed and converted to digital format. So everything is available to the general public that we have on the State Grange website. So if you go back a couple slides from there near the end of those slides that I shared, and we can send any of you that want a copy of those slides, you just go to the State Grange website, and at the top of the homepage, oh, there's Jen sharing that. You go to departments, and then you go down to History Committee, and then there's all of those sub-pages under the History Committee. So for instance, if you want to look at, let's say, the Journal of Proceedings, and you want a particular year, maybe you want to see your name in the year that you took the 6th degree. And if you know when that is, you can click on Journals of Proceedings, and it will bring up Journals of Proceedings, where first we have it listed in 25-year increments. And then if you click on any one of those, which one do you want us to click on, Jim?
Try 75 and 99.
All right.
For fun.
And then there are all of the journals for each of those years. Is there a particular year you want to look at?
Not really, but just click on one. I want to see what it looks like.
You want to see what it looks like? Well, it looks like a Journal of Proceedings. They've all been microfilmed, and they are an exact image of those proceedings. And you can just scroll through to whatever page. You can click. You can hit that magnifying glass and make the size bigger. I have found that it's best to give the file a minute to load, because it seems to take longer to load if you've increased the image size. So I give it time to load, and then if I'm going to a particular page and my bifocals need a little assistance, then I click on that magnifying glass, and it'll make the size bigger and easier, therefore, to read. So that's all out there, whether you to use, whether you're a Grange member or not.
Okay, good. I just want to inform you about something. I'm a member of the Philadelphia Society for Promoting Agriculture. That is the oldest agricultural organization in America, founded back in the 1700s by Benjamin Franklin. And they meet in Philadelphia, but the last year we've been meeting on Zoom like we are right now. And this past Thursday, we had our annual meeting on Zoom, and I suggested your name and Betsy's name and Wayne's name. That I said that we are celebrating our 150th anniversary in the Grange, and I thought maybe one of you three might be a good speaker to the association. And there's a change in the person's names who's in charge of programming, and I haven't got those names yet because the president didn't have them ready. So as soon as we get those names, why I'm going to look at those three names for them to contact you and see if they can't schedule you for a meeting to talk about the Grange and its 150 years, what's happened during that period of time.
Okay, well, that's great. I'm aware of that organization, both because I think you've mentioned it to me. I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, George Steele was involved in that.
Yeah, George was involved in that. Yes, he was.
During his lifetime. So sure, we would be very glad to share information about the Grange.
Okay, well, as soon as we get that name, the person that's in charge of that, why, I'll give them your names and contact information. And I'll share that name with you also as well.
Okay, thank you. Of course, even though I have a big interest in history, I'm always concerned about sharing information about the Grange and what it can do to build it currently and assure its continuance into the future. I think that's an ongoing challenge for all of us, and hope that in some way, in some small way, perhaps we can find the key that if this information is available and we share it with people, that people will want to be part of the Grange. So it's sort of an ulterior motive, but I have to admit that we haven't found that key, as at least not as much as we'd like. I'd like to hear if any of the rest of you have any comments or questions or thoughts that you'd like to add. Again, the question is, how do we make our history come alive and make our organization be relevant for the present and for the future? Because I, for one, am concerned about our trajectory, where we're going. I think there's a lot of good things happening, but unfortunately, at the local level, our numbers are frightening. One of the things, for instance, that I do is our state secretary, Debbie Campbell, gives me, as chairman of the history committee, the quarterly report summary that goes to the National Grange. And I use that to make sure that those ledgers on the website are correct in terms of what Granges are active, what Granges have become inactive, etc. And when I look at that listing of our Granges, which is now only about 175 or thereabouts, down from 4 times that many some years ago, it's really scary to see how many Granges are listed with 10 and 12 and 14 members, knowing that it's really difficult for a Grange to operate with such a low membership. Any thoughts? We haven't heard from Anna Mae or Mary or Susan. Would you like to get anything before we close this morning? We thought you had all the answers and that you would be able to tell us what we should do.
And we thought you had all the answers, so there we are.
Yeah, well, I guess we're all sort of in the same boat. Because I find myself, maybe Mary, you having an interest in history, maybe you find yourself the same way. You have an interest in history, but you also have an interest in the Grange and its future, and you try to say, how can we, use one to build the other? How can we make people appreciate what the Grange has done and what we can do, and maybe even more importantly, what we should be doing.
Doug, I would like to commend Betsy for putting together that study committee for the diversity and taking a look, doing a study and taking a look at this, because it's going to be more difficult for local Granges to do anything if the national Grange doesn't support them. And I think this is a step in the right direction.
Well, I commend it too, and I just hope that some materials, whether they're discussion guides or whatever, will come out from National Grange and filter down to the local Grange, because as a Grange lecturer, I would like to know how to present this in a positive way and have some real discussion, so that our Granges are at least aware of how do we appear to the community. And a lot of our communities are diverse, but some Grange communities are still very, white, and that's fine. But we're not, as an organization, even reaching those very homogeneous communities, or our membership numbers would be better. So maybe we need to think about how it is we can reach out in communities that are not maybe quite as diverse, let alone reaching out to those where there is a lot of diversity.
That's a great idea, Doug. I made a note of that to suggest to the committee that they should look at coming up with discussion guides to send out. We're trying to distribute the report. We sent it out to all the state presidents a couple times and encouraged them to distribute it to the local Granges, but they don't always do that.
Well, and I got the copy of that report, and I've read it about 3 different times, and I have yet to come up with a way to present it to the local people. I mean, we gave it out at a Grange meeting and said, please read this, and we'd like to discuss it. And then you come to the next meeting and say, well, what do you think about that? And everybody just sort of sits there. So I think we need some real non-controversial ways to ask questions to get discussion started. I'm not sure what or how that is, but that's the only way it's going to make an impact at the local level.
Doug, I have another suggestion for you to consider.
Okay.
When you put these reports out, have you ever thought about putting them in Spanish or in French or whatever? When I get a statement from my bank, I have 1 page of all these different languages in there. Maybe we ought to think about this as well. As a translator, translating this stuff into different languages, particularly languages that are that's common in the local communities. Here in Bucks County, we got a lot of Spanish, and so if we had this stuff in Spanish where they can understand it, then might help us a little bit. Right,
and then if we would have that resource, we have to figure out the way to get it into that community.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But well, I think our hour is up. Jen, did you have anything else that you would like to say as we close?
I just have one thought about kind of bringing it back to your question about how we use what we know about our past to move forward. And I think it's really critical to know and to recognize as we look through the accomplishments of our past, that those were things that were very relevant and meaningful for that time, and to celebrate those successes, but to realize the same things that were meaningful or relevant to our members or to the general community 50 years ago or 10 years ago or even 2 years ago are not necessarily going to be the things that are going to be meaningful and relevant in our time. And so acknowledging and celebrating those things that we've accomplished in the past, but trying to continually find new ways to find that meaningfulness and relevance as we move forward, I think is really key.
Well, I certainly agree with you, and I thank all of you who are on this call for your interest in our history and what you can do to encourage local Granges to preserve their records, for local Grange members to be proud of our history and to use it as a stepping stone to work into the future. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, Jen, and your committee for giving us the opportunity to share this information. And we hope that some additional folks will log on and look at the recording of this.
Yes, thank you.
Can I make one more comment? Doug, I would like to commend you for what you've done for the history of the Pennsylvania State Grange.
Well,
Here, here.
Mary was the chair and started a lot of this a number of years ago, and we've tried to build and expand on it. And we'll keep trying. As we move through the anniversary, the state president, Wayne Campbell, has appointed the history committee to be the anniversary committee. So we're serving in a dual role. I guess he thought we had all those records preserved and there wasn't anything else for us to do. So now we have that for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Your committee has done yeoman work, Doug, and I celebrate you for that. It's marvelous what you've done.
Well, thank
It's
you.
amazing.
Yeah.
That, I was just going to say, Doug, now that you've had Pennsylvania all documented, I really need help at National. I've got that sub-basement packed full of records that I don't want to be the decision maker of what is valuable to keep and what's not. But we can't continue like that. It's deteriorating, every day.
Well, Jen is and I have spent a lot of time at the state office, and we have thrown out dumpsters of things, but we've also tried to preserve. And again, our concern was that those official records be microfilmed and digitized, which does take some financial resources, but surprisingly, it's not as expensive as you might think. Anna Mae, you're our treasurer. What's the sort of a ballpark for all those records that we sent, the journals, the registers, that whole list of all over a period of a couple of years? How many thousand did we spend on that?
Man, you're really taxed. I'm thinking it's probably somewhere around maybe 8 to 10. Because we had like the big chunks we had, the bills were like 4,500, that type of thing. And then we had a couple smaller ones. So I'm just off the top of my head thinking it was probably between $8,000 and $10,000 for everything that we've done so far.
And considering that was preserving the records for almost 150 years, that's a relatively minor amount, but obviously you have to have the resource to do that. We've been very pleased with the company that I think Jen found, IMR is it Wilkes-Barre, Hazleton, someplace?
Yes, Hazleton, and they were recommended to us by the state archives. We had met with the state archives to find out more about what was going on. And it was at that time that they told us about the moratorium on accepting new records because they are running low on storage in the current facility. And they are the ones who recommended looking at IMR. And I really expected that it was going to be more cost prohibitive than it really has turned out to be. We've been pleasantly surprised and very pleased with their work.
So, for me, the bottom line is not only did we preserve those records, because if the paper deteriorates, we have both the microfiche and the digital copy, but we've also made it accessible that the public, the members can use the information. Because again, sitting on dusty shelves or in boxes in the basement is not sharing that information. So, well, Betsy, we can talk sometime. We'll see what we can do. Jen, you'll have to look at your calendar. If we have to go to Washington for 2 months or whatever, we'll have to see about that. But it is it seemed like a big task, but you know, we did a little piece at a time, and we managed to get it done. And IMR has been wonderful in guiding us through that process.
You must have got a good deal, because I'm sure that we spent between 15 and 20,000 just on those charter application books for the rest of the states.
Oh, are they all microfilmed?
Yes, the IMR is still working on them, but they have them all, so they're like 3/4 finished.
Yeah, the cost is by volume of the work that is done. So and also I think on the quality of the materials that you're providing them. So things that are a bit more degraded, that they need to use a bit more caution. If they need to take apart binding because the binding is in bad enough condition or they can't get good enough images. I mean, they always check with us. So I think we had one book of ours that the binding needed to be taken apart, but those things add some extra incidental cost to it. But
yeah,
yeah,
these things are really bad. So
yeah, but if anybody watching this either on here or on YouTube has any questions or anything about IMR, please reach out to the State Grange History Committee. I'd be happy to get you in touch with IMR or work with you to get your local Grange's records preserved. The cost, how IMR does it is that they charge a cost for the initial imaging of each page, of scanning each page. And then it's a very, very small cost in addition to that to convert it to the other format. So for example, it might be around I think for our last project that we just submitted some records for, it was about 35 cents per image or in that ballpark to scan. And usually depending on the size of the materials being scanned, they can scan 2 pages at once. So it's not necessarily a 1-for-1 cost, but that 35 cents per image or so that they charge, then it's only an additional 9 cents to convert that scanned image to film as well. So you're not paying it's not as simple as paying double the cost. You're paying the initial scanning fee to get you the digital or PDF copy, and then only a super incidental cost. I think it's 9 cents per image to then convert that scanned image to film. So we have found it to be much more reasonable than we ever expected. And I'd be more than happy to talk with local Granges or other state Granges or whoever might be watching if it's something that they have an interest in pursuing.
I have found as we're trying to gather some material together for this 150th anniversary of the State Grange, that one of the most useful resources has been the Journal of Proceedings. And that would be something that I would be interested in having access to the national journals of proceedings, you know, not just the recent years, which obviously are on the website, but for, you know, many past years. So, you know, we didn't do everything at once. We had to do it as we had the resources. So maybe national can consider chunking it up too.
We do have almost all of the journals digitized or scanned. And I'm not sure if they're available on the website or not, but we do have them.
I know the recent journals are on there, but I'm not aware of where the older ones might be, you know, like,
okay,
maybe they're on there and I just don't know how to find them.
No, they may not be, but we should be able to put them up easily.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And all of you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for Doug for presenting this morning and for all of you for joining us. And I'll encourage you to tune in next Saturday, May 15th at 10 a.m. on Zoom for the Community Service Virtual Leadership Workshop. Thank you very much and have a good day.